Welcome everybody to this short talk on education leadership and the work of Pierre Bourdieu, thinking through change, scale and contradiction. This is a short talk I gave to a group of honours students in education management and leadership at the University of Johannesburg in September of 2021. Now the lecture is based on a paper I wrote for the Southern African Review of Education with Professor Salim Bali and Professor Caroline Spreen in 2020. And that paper was titled Education, COVID and Care, wherein we try to examine in a comparative manner how the COVID-19 pandemic was exacerbating and making far more obvious particular contradictions built into public education under neoliberal conditions, and how we could see those contradictions starting to bite both in the US and in South Africa as schools were forced to close in the face of the pandemic. But the focus of this lecture is rather to say, how do we understand leading in such contradictory systems, and what can the work of Pierre Bourdieu help us to do when thinking about leadership under these conditions? So the overarching question through this very short talk was, what does leading mean? Given Bourdieu's well understood analysis about schools and education systems as apparatus of social reproduction, that is effectively replicating the power relations, the asymmetries, the inequities from one generation to the next, and masking this replication by positing the dominant economic and cultural practices of a particular hegemonic group as the practices everybody should aspire to and as neutral and meritorious. That's a well understood critique from Bourdieu. I'm interested in what it tells us about leading and managing education institutions in contemporary moment. So how do we understand these forces that Bourdieu is asking us to notice? Forces that show that an arbitrary class and an arbitrary culture, which has nothing intrinsic about it that makes it good or better, is framed as good or better. And while that distinction is arbitrary, it has very real socio-material consequences. So whether speaking English is better or not, well, actually, there's nothing intrinsic about English that makes it superior to other languages. But it is framed as such by education policies and practices with very real consequences for people who do not get sufficient access to mastering proficiency in English. I'll keep a language example running through a lot of this lecture as we go, because it's a useful one for thinking about both what Bourdieu is saying, but also how we might respond to these conditions as education leaders or managers. So I'm interested in saying, given what Bourdieu tells us, what can and can't school leaders and managers do? What are the gaps and the constraints on agency at the level of the school? Now, I just want to foreground that what Nancy Fraser means by social reproduction in the original paper, the Black, Spreen and Valley 2020 paper that prompted this lecture, is not the same as what Bourdieu means by reproduction. There is overlap in the meanings, but they're not quite the same. Bourdieu means the replication of all the social relations and the power asymmetries and inequities built into them from one generation to the next. Fraser, in drawing on social reproduction theory from people like Muthivhi and others, is talking about the ability of a society to sustain itself, so life-making. Life-making in the form of putting food on the table, in the form of healthcare, in the form of shelter, in the form of caring for the sick, etc., which maintains a population in a state of health and well-being. By contrast to a sphere of production, which a classic Marxist analysis would notice, which is the manufacturing and production of commodities for a market in order to make profit. So when Fraser's talking about reproduction, she's talking about reproduction in contrast to production. But that's what Bourdieu is talking about. He's talking about the persistence of power relations from one generation to another. And it's important to notice that there's a subtle difference in the use of the word reproduction there. A quick recap. the key ideas in Bourdieu's theory: habitus, a disposition, an internalized schema of how to be in and to navigate the world. It comes from our early socialization, from our community, our family of origin. And it is, Bourdieu calls it a structured structure predisposed to act as a structuring structure. He's a little opaque and cryptic like that. But what he's really talking about is how we embody tacitly, implicitly, ways of moving, ways of speaking, turns of phrase, conceptual schemas that help us to understand cause and effect, or to understand values. We kind of absorb these like sponges as children, and they continue to shape quietly how we move through and interact with the world. A nice example I like to use when illustrating habitus is if you move home and you needing to go home from your place of work and you on autopilot drive to your old home. That's an example of habitus. It's an habituated route home that you have become so familiar with that it is literally, you're not even thinking about it anymore. It is almost built into your nerves and into your muscles without thinking. It's in your body now. And until you actually shall I say, explicitly and cognitively override that and continue to override it until you embody and absorb the new route home, when you go on autopilot, you'll just go to your old home. Another example is if you do renovations in a home and you move a light switch, and that light switch has been there for 20 years. You're tired, you're going to bed, you're not thinking about it, you just reach out to where the old switch was. That's an example of habitus, a sort of embodied knowledge that helps you to move through the world and then misfires or doesn't fit when the world changes and you don't. A second concept in Bourdieu's toolbox is field, a set of social practices that sort of form a self-recognizing community. And a field includes social relations of force and power, as well as tacit rules that constitute legitimate participation in that field. So a field could be the field of journalism, the field could be the field of education, which most of us are very familiar with, to the point that we struggle to see it because it's overly familiar, it's too close. The field could be the field of art critique, which to an outsider is bizarre. When you talk about the Trump de oil or this or that or this postmodernist, I mean, for most people outside the field of art critique or critical art consumption, what goes on inside that field is very difficult to fathom. But for people apprenticed into and socialized into that field, it's almost second nature. They understand the logic about how things inside work. Another nice example is the military. Most people are not participants in the field of military practices and would find the rigid discipline, the curbing of freedoms, the uniformity, the strong authoritarian hierarchy within the military rubs us up the wrong way. We'd probably resist it. We would refuse to just take someone else's instructions blindly, even if they seem to be at our own, to our own detriment. You know, drop down and give me 100 push-ups. But within the military field, they make sense to the people who practice that. And the discipline has an internal logic regarding the need to have well-honed instincts in moments of conflict or crisis. And so you don't want your soldiers questioning you when there's a battle going on. You don't want your soldiers to even have to think twice. You want their instincts to be automatically habituated. And so for people who are apprenticed and socialized and folded into the field of military practice, the rules of that field, the doxa, make absolute sense, even if they're bizarre to people outside that. And finally, the last in Bourdieu's trio is capital. Now, often when people are reading Bourdieu, they mistake the concept of capital for just resources. But capital is specific to a field of practice. Capital is economic, cultural, including embodied cultural resources such as language, such as knowing how to dress, such as knowing deference, protocols of respect, etc. Or social, people you know, being connected to the right networks that yield particular benefit in a particular practice. So a resource can be capital in one field, but not in another. what is beneficial in one field might not be beneficial in another. For example, being a fluent first language English speaker is hugely advantageous in the field of academia. But to be a monolingual English speaker, which is absolutely fine in academia, is not exactly advantageous if you are an ethnographer or an anthropologist trying to do field work amongst indigenous communities where no one speaks English at all. In fact, it's a disadvantage. So one field, your English carries a lot of weight. Speaking English takes you a long way. In another field, being monolingual English speaker is actually not going to serve you very well at all. You've got the same resource, but the practices are different, and hence whether those resources become capital is different. So I just wanted to, for those of you not familiar with Bourdieu's concepts or vaguely familiar, just recap those before we move on to the rest of the lecture. So the first thing that we try to outline in the Black Spring Valley paper is that the current arrangement of the field of education, particularly public education, basic public education, although these apply to private and higher as well, is deeply contradictory. And that contradiction arises from an increasing pressure on education systems worldwide to, quote unquote, produce human capital, which, I mean, the concept of human capital I find abhorrent in and of itself. People are not capital. But that is what the strong logic, the strong raison d'etre is inside of our education systems, that you kind of got to go to school so you can get a job. We're producing future human resources for the labor market. And we want to also do that increasing the efficiencies. Not only must you push more students through, but you must get them through in the minimum amount of time. So without failing or repeating, dropping out and coming back, etc. And this is the pressure schools are under. But at the same time, schools are often expected to provide care and support, especially for children coming from homes who are struggling to meet the basic needs. So for the poor, schools are often places where children get food. They're often places where children get health checkups. Schools are expected to provide transport when the public transport system is not working. When parents go to work, schools are expected to be places of childcare, etc., etc. So these are not about producing a future worker. These are about saying, what are your basic human needs as a child? And if your parents are struggling to meet them because they're working 3 jobs and are never home, or it's a single mom who is struggling to pay the bills, schools are often expected to step in and fill that gap. And what we're trying to show is that when schools closed during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, all of a sudden everybody realized that schools were filling in all these extra functions as well. There was this contradiction between schools' role as places of production and schools' roles as places of social reproduction, especially for the economically marginalized. And anyone who's worked in schools for the economically marginalized will know that often these two imperatives are at odds with each other. That the work teachers do in order to listen to children, to make them feel emotionally supported, to be caring and provide an adult presence in their lives is actually antithetical to get through the curriculum, get it faster, get a higher test score. And they butt up against each other a lot. And that's what we were trying to describe in the paper. But what I'd like to foreground in this lecture today is that if leaders and managers of schools don't notice these contradictions and tensions, they're not going to understand the forces acting on them and the strategic choices that they have to make in order to weather and navigate these contradictory imperatives for their students and their staff in their schools. Now, when one is weathering and making choices about what is to be done, especially where there are competing and contradictory imperatives, you're always necessarily going to be informed by some kind of an ethics. You're always going to be deciding based on what you think is good or right thing to do. Now, sometimes you might feel that that's about maximizing students' test scores. Sometimes you might feel that maximizing test scores shouldn't matter if the child before you is in enormous emotional distress and in need of care. And so you are always, whatever you decide, necessarily being informed by an ethical an ethical orientation to what you think is good and right and what you value. What does it mean to be ethical leaders in a contradictory field like this? If we're going to think about leadership as something that is concerned about social and economic inequality, as something that not only strives to attempt to offer opportunities to the individual students before us registered at our school, enrolled in our classes, but thinking about those students as part of a broader fabric, a society in which they need to live and grow and thrive as they become adults, then we need to understand the origins and mechanisms of those injustices. And this is where we're going to try and use Bourdieu to help us think through some of this. He might say we need to notice that the arbitrary positions itself as necessary. And this is a classic strategy of hegemony. This is a classic strategy of domination, where the dominant group, the hegemonic group, will say, well, our way is the only way. There is no alternative. It's necessary. An example that came up during COVID is where people said, well, we have to reopen schools, we have to remove COVID restrictions because parents need to go to work and children need to keep learning, and basically the kids will be all right, they won't get sick. And there's no other way. We just have to get back to normal as quickly as possible. Whereas some of the people who are more concerned with social justice said, well, hang on, normal's not great at the best of times, never mind when there's a virus that we don't understand floating around making people very, very sick. We don't understand stuff not only about the nature of the pathogen that is causing havoc on our social arrangements, but what we were giving kids wasn't fantastic even before COVID-19 hit. And so aren't there alternatives? One of the alternatives being, for example, that we keep schools closed in order to protect families and keep children safe from illness and their loved ones safe, understanding children as potentially silent vectors of COVID. And we use broadcast media, radio and television. I think Burkina Faso is an example where this was utilized in order to ensure that learning losses are minimized during school closure times. And that we could use school closures as an opportunity for rectifying other issues in the system. What I'm trying to say is that the dominant voice of get schools open again as quickly as possible positioned its perspective as the only perspective, and well, and the negative consequences of this are unfortunate, but there's no other way. As soon as someone says that, one must be very wary of a strategy of hegemony, and Bourdieu would say we need to notice that, because it's a way that injustices tend to get perpetuated as being inevitable and unavoidable. But if we're going to do things differently, we need to wonder how we understand change as a mechanism within education institutions, and can Bourdieu's language help us to think about change? He's often criticized for being overly deterministic, for being a person whose language doesn't describe change. But I think if we understand that habitus and field are mutually constructive, but not in a deterministic manner, then we have a better understanding about how change happens, under what conditions it happens, and how we can push towards different types of change if we understand this relationship as dynamic. There's a concept that Bourdieu uses in his work that's very underexplored, namely hysteresis. It's got its origins originally in Aristotle, and it's actually a term often used in metallurgy, where it refers to the persistence of a magnetic field on a piece of metal. You can detect magnetic charge or the remnants of a magnetic field on a piece of metal long after it's been removed from a magnetic field that is being explicitly applied to it. What we're just trying to get at here is that when people move from a field of practice which has perhaps shaped and sedimented their habitus into something new, they experience an effect of mismatch. They experience a sense of misfiring, like things here, I don't quite understand them. The way I'm used to doing things doesn't seem to apply. Now, if you've ever been a person who has moved to a different country, some people express this as something called culture shock. And if you've ever moved from basic education to higher education and had to realize that, well, the rules of the game at high school are not how university works. You've experienced a hysteretic effect. You've experienced this mismatch. Your internalized sense of how to get about doing things every day suddenly doesn't seem to serve you so well. Things are different and you're trying to figure out how best to navigate them. So this is what is hysteresis, a sense of mismatch. And it's normally a timing mismatch, because there's a lag in your understanding of how to get about doing things. There's a lag in your habitus adaptation, if it can, once you have been introduced to a new set of practices, a new field, and as concomitant forms of capital. So what might have been a capital in your old field might not be in your new field, for example. Now, there's a lovely paper by Strand and Lizardo, 2016, which it attempts to look at this concept of hysteresis from Bourdieu as precognitive practical inclination and offer a typology of it, which I think is quite useful for thinking about change. I think it's useful for thinking about change in Bourdieusian terms. The first type of hysteretic resolution. So you've got this mismatch between habitus and field, and it is creating tension or if you like, cognitive dissonance for a particular actor. One of the ways of resolving that is what they call traditional. So the agent adapts the habitus to fit the field. That's when you eventually start autopiloting your way to your new home. So the structures and meanings around you have changed, and you eventually absorb those and reorient yourself. You can think of this as a type of assimilation. The second that they offer is what they call anomic resolution of hysteresis. So the agent is excluded from the field. It might be self-exodus through frustration. Alienation as exclusion is a way of thinking about this. So this might be a student who goes to university and just can't seem to figure out the lay of the land and how things work. They're certainly not having it explained to them in such a way that allows them to adapt, and they eventually drop out. A third type of hysteretic resolution that they offer is what they call ironic. So you might notice the field is different. You might even think the field is wrong, and you play along performatively, even though you do not subscribe to the logic of the practice that you are embedded in. This could be thought of as alienation as a type of resignation or a type of nihilism. Things don't matter. We see a lot of this in South African education, for example. It might manifest as passive resistance. It might manifest as working to rule, or presenteeism, what is called presenteeism. The person is physically present, but clearly not engaged, student or teacher. And this is where you go, I think that this practice is not okay. How things are done here is not okay. These structures are not okay. But I don't really have an option. I don't have the opportunity to change it. And so I'm going to take a detached, resigned disposition towards it. So the habitus isn't falling in line, but the person is sort of sticking around in a sort of resigned, non-committed kind of way. And the fourth type of hysteretic resolution that Strand and Lizardo offer is what they call revolutionary. That is, sufficient numbers of actors all kind of go, hang on, how things that are done around here is not all right. And we're not going to change, and we're not going to alienate ourselves from ourselves. The field needs to change. And so there's sufficient pressure from the agents with a habitus or a set of ways of doing things that builds up a critical mass, if you like, in order to try and exert change on the field instead of on the actor. Now, in the paper Black Spoon and Valley, we used Nancy Fraser's typology of responses to social injustice, which she uses a binary, affirmative and transformative. Affirmative is where there might be superficial redress, but the substance that produces injustice, the structures underneath that produce the original inequities and asymmetries of power remain intact. Whereas transformative responses to injustice are one where those very structures are reworked. You can think of this binary against Bourdieusian concepts, that affirmative are where the field remains in place and the actor must adapt or get out, or shush. So adapt is traditional, get out is anomic, shush is ironic. but the field and the power relations that it replicates and valorizes remain intact. Whereas transformative, in Fraserian terms, is where sufficient numbers of actors get together and go, actually, no, the way that this field orients practice is the problem. The fact that our schooling system segregates students racially is the problem. We're not going to say that kids must go to separate schools. We're going to say the system has changed, as an example. But I'd also argue that if leaders and education managers are going to understand Bourdieusian ideas for thinking about their situations and the dilemmas before them, they also need to notice scale. Now, Bourdieu's concept of fields is very useful for talking about scale. There's the field, how we do things, what we value, our systems, our meanings at the local level of the school. And each school constitutes a little microfield in and of its own right. But that is embedded within a broader field of education regionally. That might be a district, that might be a circuit, that might be a province, whatever your education system structure demarcates as the next layer up. Of course, then there's the field of education in a national education system, and this is premised on our current political arrangements in what Nancy Fraser calls Keynesian Westphalian nation states. So we organize society in countries or nation states at the moment, and we tend to have policy that applies at the national level. But of course, in an increasingly globalized world, nation states do not act independently of each other. And so there's also a field of education internationally, how we understand education certification or qualifications to move across boundaries and borders. Is my certificate from country A recognized in country B, and if not, why, etc. So there's a broader field. And of course, as labor moves around the world more fluidly, or at least certainly capital moves around the world more fluidly in order to go to the point of cheapest labor, we also find that laborers in different countries are in competition with each other. And hence, if you think of schools as points of production of future human labor, future skills, then you're going to find that schools are necessarily in competition with each other too. All of this is embedded in the field of political, cultural, and economic power. And the ways of thinking and doing, the meanings, discourses, and structures at the broader fields articulate with the smaller fields. Now, everyday activities of school management and leadership tend to operate at the level of the local, within the bounds of the field of the school. But anyone who's worked in these places will tell you that you're not just free to do as you wish, you are constrained. You might want to change your language of teaching and learning for your students because you recognize that, well, we all speak Xhosa, none of us speak English fluently, surely it's better for us to teach and learn together in Xhosa. Well, you could if your broader field of education nationally didn't insist that exams were in English, for example. So you're not free to choose just as anything you wish, independent of constraint. Structures and discourses at those broader scales tend to constrain what is possible at the level of the local. And that's often why change is so hard. We often focus on individual schools when thinking about the unit of change and the scale of change, especially in education, leadership, and management, without understanding the bigger picture. So one of the things that the paper that precipitated this lecture was trying to do was to lift out the relations between these scales, as well as how education articulates with other fields like economics, so that we can see what is constraining from change and avoid replicating the status quo by thinking that change can happen at one scale without understanding how it works against the other scales. Now, one of the things that education leaders and managers often are struggling to do is to find gaps at the level of the local. So one of the things that perhaps might be doable in using the language of Bourdieu again is to notice what constitutes capital at a school and what does not. So what resources are available in the school that are perhaps unorthodox, are perhaps not recognized by the broader system, but very much a strength of the local school, if only it can be seen as such. Here's an example. A student who could speak 6 languages, but not English, This person has loads of resources, a rich linguistic repertoire, but none of these are cultural capital in a field of schooling that only values English. One of the things that education leaders and managers might do is say, well, how do we include what students already know? How do we make our school more appreciative and leverage more richly what students know, their histories, their rights, their languages, etc. Translanguaging, which has been suggested by some practitioners who are interested in linguistic social justice, is one of the ways one can do this. Rather than framing students' choices as, well, you either use your home languages or you learn English. It's a classic hegemonic example of saying, well, then we just have to go for English, obviously. Remember what I was talking about where you say there is no other way, framing the arbitrary is necessary. Translanguaging advocates would say, no, actually, students can acquire more than one language at the same time if you understand how to do it well as teachers, as education institutions. And if you train your teachers to do that, you can use what the student is bringing to the classroom to make rich meaning. The student is less alienated from their schooling experience, and they're acquiring cultural capital of language that will serve them in the broader field of power, namely English. Another example is Muthivhi 2010, Ploughing New Fields of Knowledge, about community schools in Venda in the 1920s, where a group of girls who'd just come back from their traditional Chivenda Domba rites were told by missionaries that if they wanted to go to school, they had to stop their quote-unquote heathen ways. And these girls said, no, we don't feel like we have to abandon our own cultural practices and beliefs, an entire ontology of the world, of the social, in order to learn maths and science. And so they set up their own school. It's interesting to notice that some of those schools in Venda still are amongst some of the top performing schools in terms of formal curriculum attainment, with that history of insisting that children should not have to be forced to choose between learning and being themselves. Another example is in the text Leading Learning, Making Hope Practical in Schools by Lingard, Hayes, Mills, and Christie. There was a nice example of the school in that text where children served in a rural Australian school, mostly an Aboriginal population of children. The school realized that rather than trying to ask students to not be themselves at school, they actually brought in the elders of the community and folded in practices around knowledge conveyance, mentorship, counseling from the elders into the school's decision-making and the school's way of life, with great effect. So this is what I mean by acting at the level of the local. How can you see what your students do bring, and how perhaps the way that your school field is excluding resources as a potential form of local cultural or social capital. Now, this kind of adjustment tends to be easier for cultural issues. And we'll often see that, at least in the South African press, that school leadership and management are often focused on issues of cultural injustice, where they'll be looking at gender or race. It's much less easy to do this sort of thing for economic issues. So a class replication still remains very strong, reproducing inequality, because it's operating at a much broader field in terms of the way that the national and regional education system is financed. So you can change your hair policy, and you can certainly discipline teachers who behave in inappropriate ways to children of color. But addressing money issues is quite different. And of course, one cannot totally disentangle questions of gender and race from questions of class. And that brings me to the final part of this lecture, which is to ask where the moral imperative for education leaders resides if the potential for change at the level of the school is so limited. What is the responsibility of school leaders when the actions that they can take only at their local level cannot address the injustices that their students and staff face? What then must a good leader think is their responsibility and moral duty? Do you have a duty to push for change at a broader scale? And so I'd like to leave you with a thought regarding what Angela Davis said, where she said, I'm no longer accepting the things I can't change. I'm changing the things I can't accept. But if we think back to that typology of resolving hysteresis that Strand and Lizardo gave us earlier, the only way of changing the broader field was when a critical mass of agents together said, no, we're not changing our habitus, we're changing the field. And so one must understand that transformative change, where the field is what must adjust, not the individual, requires collective action. It is not something one can pursue alone. In summary, the field of education is wrought with contradictions, particularly tensions between its social role as production of future human labor and reproduction, i.e. nurturing and caring for children. And leading in such a field is incredibly challenging. You need to notice these contradictions. You need to notice how they're biting down on you. You need to notice the relations of scale if you're going to pick a strategy for change that's actually going to be effective. Now, if you're interested in social justice, by which I mean making sure that everybody has an equal opportunity to get a flourishing life, irrespective of the body they were born into, irrespective of the community they were born into, irrespective of the language that they learned in the home where they were raised. That means looking for change in the field, not in the student. We would ideally want transformative rather than affirmative types of change. And while leadership at the level of the school can recognize broader resources as capital at that local level, this tends to be focused primarily on cultural forms of capital, and it has a lot of limits. So does leadership, ethical leadership, moral leadership, require us to look beyond the level of the school and to ask how we change broader fields together collectively? Thank you very much for watching. I hope you found this interesting. Look forward to any feedback in the comment section.